have a
Where
list.
did the money come from? That was the question. Where
Even
did the
that.
money come from?
Oh, well, where
Is
did
there a money
yeah,
free?
yeah,
Is it debt? Are we going to have to pay it back in the
yeah, yeah.
future? You know,
So
these are the questions.
let's do that. Where did the money come from? Because I think we have right now in the rearview mirror just very, very clear examples of exactly how governments muster the firepower to commit to spending trillions and trillions of dollars when just months before everybody was talking about, if we want to spend money, we have to find money. How will you pay for it? I mean, if you think back to, 2019 and the presidential campaign and the Democratic primaries, and, we had a very crowded slate of Democratic presidential hopefuls. You, Giannis, Naomi, and I know well some of the people who were vying for the for the presidential nomination on the Democratic side. And people had, platforms that ranged in ambition from very, very progressive, big ticket things, a $16 trillion Green New Deal, canceling all student loan debt. I mean, very ambitious, all the way down, the scale to the other end, the more moderate sort of things. But every single candidate at every turn was dogged by the question, how will you pay for it? Where will the money come from? And every candidate attempted to demonstrate where the revenue would come from, how the taxes would be increased to generate the revenue to allow for this spending to take place. Everything happened in this sort of a budgeting framework, right? The idea that you have to find the money and pay for your spending. And then COVID happened, right? And this is just months later, really. And it's March of 2020. And all of a sudden, without really a moment's hesitation, Congress begins spinning out multi-trillion-dollar spending packages. And not just in the US, not just Congress, but around the world. Governments are committing huge sums of money. And so when we say, how did they do it? Where did the money come from? Here's what happens. Congress writes a bill. And in our case, in March, the biggest bill was known as the CARES Act. That was a $2.2 trillion piece of legislation. That legislation is Congress's way of ordering up, $2.2 trillion from its bank, from the Federal Reserve. Congress did not go out hat in hand to China or to the investor class or to anyone else and raise up 2.2 trillion. They don't have to. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress can commit to spending money that they do not have, right? What they do is pass the bill. And if the votes are there, the money follows. In a very real sense, the votes are the pay for. The votes are where the money comes from. So once the bill is drafted and once the votes are there and the legislation is passed, the spending happens as the central bank, the government's fiscal agent, carries out the payments that have been authorized by Congress on behalf of the US Treasury. Now, how do they carry out payments? Wait for this. I can't hold up my keyboard because I'm using my laptop, but if I could hold up my keyboard, I would hold up my keyboard because that's how the payments are carried out. The Federal Reserve uses nothing more than a computer keyboard to credit the appropriate bank accounts with digital dollars that are known as reserves. And then the recipient of those funds has their account credited by their bank. So this is all done electronically through crediting of bank accounts, and that's where the money comes from. So we've seen it. We saw it with the 2.2 trillion in March. They did it again in December of last year, a $900 billion package. And then just last month, Congress came in with one more COVID rescue package, 1.9 trillion. Again, a piece of legislation that sent just one set of instructions to the Federal Reserve. Go change the numbers up in the appropriate bank accounts. If you got that $1,400 check, you got a credit to your account. The keyboard did the work, and the digital dollars appeared in your account. If you're getting extra unemployment compensation, that's how that's happening. So what we're entering now is a different phase. And I think this is where I'm going to wrap up with this, Giannis, but this is where I'm in agreement with you. I don't think that we have, broken the austerity mindset altogether, because what Democrats are talking about now with this climate/infrastructure package is, something that's been proposed by the White House, something on the order so far of 2.25 trillion. But this time they want to, quote unquote, pay for it. They don't want to pass this bill the way the last three bills that I just described were passed. They want to offset the spending, which means they want to send two sets of instructions to the central bank. One set of instructions that tells them to go out and credit the bank accounts of the workers who will do the work, repairing America's crumbling infrastructure, putting up electric vehicle charging stations and doing care work and all the rest. Those people will get credits to their accounts. The other set of instructions would tell the central bank to debit, mark down the numbers in the accounts of many corporations, because Congress has decided that it wants to write a bill that says we're going to spend money, but we're also going to raise taxes. So two sets of instructions. And this is falling more into a kind of, I don't want to necessarily call it austerity, but when Biden went before the American people and talked about this, he said that his plan would raise more revenue than he is even proposing to spend. And he added that that would help reduce the deficit and debt long term. So when you hear stuff like that, that's definitely beginning to sound an awful lot like an administration that's starting to worry about deficits and debt.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Stephanie and I have had this debate a little bit where I just am like, I'm really in favor of raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and I get and I think you are too. Like in theory, we want to do it not because we need it to pay for this, but because we have absolutely untenable levels of inequality, and we need redistributive policies because inequality of the kind that we have is a moral hazard. It's epically dangerous that we have a billionaire class with so much excess capital that they're able to not only buy off our political class, but build multiple escape routes, including literally their planet Bs, right? The slogan of the climate justice movement is there is no planet B, but Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk beg to differ because they're building rocket ships to go there to escape the mess they've made. And I think that's it's a moral hazard for the wealthy to not have to live in the mess that they create. The rockets to Mars are an extreme expression of this, but I think we're seeing the retreat of the wealthy into sort of gated castles of various kinds in extreme forms throughout the pandemic, right? And I think the sort of stay-at-home orders have really accelerated that process where it's like, the home has the classroom, the home has the boardroom, the home has everything that you need, and anything that you don't have can be delivered by drone or through some no-touch technology and so on. So I'm interested, Stephanie, that you feel that the tax increase is the tell that we are going to face austerity, because my fear is that if we don't have the tax increase, that it increases our chances of a couple years down the road being told, oh, we've driven up the deficit so much that now we can't do anything more. And we know that even though 2.25 is a staggering sum, it's also not enough. If we want to have climate action on this at the speed and scale that we actually need to prevent catastrophic warming, it's about a third of the size of the spending that we need. So I'm worried that if we don't increase taxes and increase revenue, that it accelerates the point at which we get told, sorry, coffers are empty, we can't do anything. But tell me why I'm wrong, Stephanie, because...
All right. So here's the thing. I think that almost no one any longer believes the coffers are bare, the deficits of the past constrain the spending capacity of the future. We were told that with the Obama deficits. We need a Simpson-Bowles commission. We have to have austerity. We're not going to be able to survive. My God, the deficit. So we got austerity. And we got the pivot to austerity. We got Trump. Trump comes in and he wants to do these huge tax cuts. And people like Larry Summers, right, who was Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. He was Obama's senior economic advisor, head of the National Economic Council. Larry goes ballistic. Larry hates the idea of the Republican tax cuts. He does one of his interventions. He goes all over the media. In November of 2017, Larry's all over the place. And he's saying, if the Republicans pass these tax cuts, these are his words, we will be living on a shoestring for decades to come because of the increase in the deficits. We will be living on a shoestring for decades to come. Republicans passed the tax cuts the following month. Deficits increase. CBO says by 1.9 trillion over 10 years. We have a huge increase in the deficit. What happens? Growth picks up a little bit. Unemployment goes down a little bit. Inequality widens. Inflation stays low. Coronavirus comes and we're spending trillions and trillions of dollars. So what I'm saying first is, I think everyone can now see that, you know, the government doesn't have to keep its powder dry. We don't have to run small deficits or anything like that in order to be able to afford to do things in the future. Now, the bigger point for me, Naomi, is this, and I did a thread yesterday because I get really agitated about where I think this administration is going right now and the mistakes I see them making. So here's what we have. The Biden administration says 2.25. That's what they come out with, and they want to pay for every penny of it, mostly through increased taxes on corporations. They want to take the corporate income tax rate from 21% back up to 28%, right? Republicans dropped it from 35% to 21. Democrats want to go from 21 to 28. Well, Biden does. But already a number of Democrats are saying no. They're pushing back. They don't want to go to 28. They're buying into this. We'll lose competitiveness and all that sort of stuff. Maybe we'll go to 25. Now, as soon as you do that, you've given up some revenue. So then what do? Do you then scale down the ambition of your spending package because you've lost some revenue? So you say, well, we can only do a smaller package now. Do you start fighting over different taxes to increase? Do you really think that in this Senate that we have today, that you have 50 Democrats who will vote for a slew of tax increases? I guarantee you there is not support for a wealth tax. Forget about it. It's impossible. What about all the rest of the things that you might imagine that Democrats could do? That you're going to have a hell of a fight. I'm seriously concerned that the votes aren't there. Yeah. If the votes are there, terrific. Go for it.
No, they're not there. Joe Manchin's not going to vote for a tax increase.
Yeah. So here's the thing that I said in this thread. I said, if the votes are there, great. Go knock yourselves out. Push taxes up. Do your offsets and you know, play the pay for game. Go do it. But what if the votes aren't there? I want to know that there's a plan B. And so I suggested a plan B yesterday. The IRS commissioner testified yesterday before, I think, the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden's committee. The IRS commissioner comes in and he sits down and he says, you know, if we had enough funding to enforce the tax laws that are already on the books, we could get an extra $1 trillion a year. That's 10 trillion over 10 years, which, by the way, is the same number that people like Ed Markey and AOC are saying we should be spending 10 trillion, not 2.25. So Kelton comes on and does a big Twitter thread and says, hey, has anybody noticed that there's 10 trillion in low-hanging fruit here? You don't even have to vote to raise a single tax. Give the IRS the resources they need. Let them go out and generate you 10 trillion and go for the much bigger package. So that's where I am.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. And I definitely think strategically, the push needs to be to just spend and don't hold it back. Just spend, improve people's material lives and get a bigger majority because this is just too close. It gives way too much power to certain people. And they will fight that too because of what Yana said earlier about what austerity is really about. It's about disciplining a workforce. And, you know, as you were talking, Yanis, about Mr. Peel, I was remembering this quote from a DuPont executive in 1933 opposing FDR's New Deal. And I think it was 33, maybe it was 34, where he was complaining that he had lost 5 servants because the government was paying such good wages for people to build things and paint things, and he wasn't able to hold on to his household staff. It was just a disaster for him, right? And I think if we think about that as a microcosm for what Silicon Valley is really going to be worried about, and then think about the recent union drive at an Amazon warehouse that failed. But it failed in a context where there was no competition. If you listen to workers in Bessemer who voted against the union, it's like, look, this is an abusive job. It's punishing on the body, but it pays $15 an hour and it has some benefits, and they're the only ones offering it, right? So, we need to be thinking about front loading the direct creation of well-paying job, in part because that empowers workers to demand more, right? Because they're going to be the force that are going to be demanding. And related to this is the push for better protections for unionization under the PRO Act, which I think is another really key piece of this. So how do we change the dynamics so that we can win that full 10 trillion to actually deal with the climate crisis?
Yeah, just earlier today, I read that on this very day, a number of Republicans in the Senate are introducing a bill to establish one of these fiscal responsibility commissions, like a Simpson-Bowles 2.0, and they want they want to assemble a bipartisan commission and charge them with the mandate of working together on a plan to balance the budget. So when you say they're going to fight back and make sure that money is not spent on poor people, on improving the lives materially of people and dealing with climate, this is all part of the way that they're attempting to lay the foundation for that. Now, I hope that they won't find a single Democrat to sign on, to that legislation. But, you got a number of these people who for many years have flexed their, fiscal hawkery bona fides and viewed themselves as, hawkish on the budget and so forth. So I get worried about, a number of Democratic senators who might align with these Republicans around the establishment of a commission like this, which would just undermine completely the progressive agenda.
And I think we need to be really clear that whether we're talking about the U.S. or we're talking about the UK or certainly I'm in Canada right now, austerity, a lot of it plays out not at the federal level, right? I mean, it's about cities, it's about provinces and states, and this is what's determining education budgets, and we're already starting to hear the first cries of, look, we lost our tax base, we can't afford public transit, we can't afford to pay for education. And Brian, I really want to come back to your question around what about growth? Because I think we haven't tackled that. And I think that is the elephant in the room. And it's actually weirdly possible that we could spend trillions of dollars building out green infrastructure and increase carbon emissions. Because if we aren't dealing with consumption, it's possible to have a green carbon boom, as contradictory as that is. So what we need to be doing is investing in low carbon sectors. We need to be looking at what actually improves quality of life, and investing in access to nature, recreation, giving people shorter work weeks. Really investing in well-being and the care economy, and moving away from endless consumption, fighting for the right to repair, and dealing with the mentality that we can just shift from fossil fuel extraction to green energy and live exactly how we're living. As Arundhati Roy says, middle-class environmentalists ask the question, how do we change without changing? And the answer is, we don't. We actually have to change how we live. And so I think that's a really, really key question. And yeah, I also think that whether we're dealing with a revenge of the real is another important question, because I think in some ways we are, and in another way we're dealing with a retreat into screens And this brings up my other austerity fear, which is what the agenda is of Silicon Valley and all this. Because what I worry about is cities going broke, and then smart cities coming in as the fix. And I'll give an example from Toronto, where Google tried to they tried to use Toronto as this laboratory for the smart city idea. So they tried to do this thing called, Google has this division called Sidewalk Labs, and they were going to do Sidewalk Toronto. Basically, their pitch was to the Toronto City Council: you can't fix the potholes, you can't invest in green energy, you can't invest in public transit. We'll do it all. We'll build a beautiful emerald green city, but we're also going to put you all under the most intense surveillance and data extraction, that we see anywhere outside of China. And thankfully, Toronto fought back, and in the middle of the pandemic, and it was just a little, footnote to all the drama, Google pulled out of the Sidewalk Labs, canceled their Toronto contract. But the CEO of Sidewalk Labs, when they pulled out, said, "We don't think we got off on the right foot with Toronto, but we see all kinds of post-pandemic opportunities." And what I read between the lines there is cities around the world are going to be dead broke, and we're going to come in and save the day. And we just have to have this on our radar in how we think about what the next phase of austerity looks like. It's trading our privacy for this kind of tech enclosure and privatization through the back door.
One thing I would add on the growth issue is this. For so many years, the obsession was with so-called debt sustainability and with debt to GDP ratios, right? This idea that there was for a while, we were told tipping points, that if countries allow their debt relative to their GDP to reach 90%, this is a threshold of some kind, you tip over the 90% level, and then a lot of bad things happen, the risk of fiscal crises and slower growth and all this stuff, right? So the countries that saw their debt maybe approaching that so-called tipping point then become obsessed with trying to wrestle the debt ratio down. And Giannis talked in the opening about, how counterproductive austerity is. So you start focusing on the numerator, the debt. How do we bring the debt down? Austerity. So you start cutting spending, but one person's spending is another person's income. And so you undermine the ability of that person to spend in an economy that runs on sales, right? Capitalism runs on sales, which generate revenue, which generates the profit that makes capitalism viable. So you adopt austerity to try to target the numerator, the debt, as in an attempt to reduce the numerator to bring the whole ratio down. But what happens is you crush the economy, so GDP falls, so the ratio actually gets bigger. So austerity doesn't work. But the other piece is that we become obsessed with the idea of growing our way out of debt. So if you focus on the denominator instead of the numerator, then the strategy, the economic strategy, can become, we just need to grow really fast. And if we can grow fast enough, we can outrun our debt problem. And so I think in a lot of ways, for many countries, the obsession with growth is very much bound up with this obsession that countries have about the idea that the debt is unsustainable, that it represents a burden on the future, and that you've got to get the ratio down in order to have, a fiscally sustainable sort of situation. And I think that then feeds this growth obsession, which Naomi's talking about, we have to get away from.